Betty Price is a marketing and management consultant who combines real-life experiences with practical theory to help companies strengthen their leadership teams and develop growth strategies. Prior to starting her own company more than 20 years ago, she was a newspaper and television journalist. She was part of the team that covered the tragic Hyatt Hotel skywalk collapse and coverage that earned the newspaper a Pulitzer Prize. She's written 8 books, and her leadership book, True Leaders, has been published in 7 languages, and her articles have been published in more than 500 trade publications. Her most recent book, Help! There's a Plane in My House, captures her own personal tragedy and the lessons she learned during the restoration process. And that's what this interview is about today. Welcome, Betty.
Well, welcome. Glad to be with you.
Very few people in this world have actually experienced a plane crashing into their house. So tell us a little bit about what kind of plane it was, and were you home when this happened?
Well, it was a twin-engine Aero Commander carrying freight. It was actually carrying a load of canceled checks and New York Times newspapers that were to be delivered at its destination in Oklahoma. I was not home, which is either the good news or bad news. I was actually at a client's home in Williamsburg, Virginia. And so when I got a call she got a call at 7 o'clock in the morning, and I heard her say, "Oh, just a minute, David," that was my brother-in-law, and then she said, "Just a minute, Darlene," that was my daughter-in-law. So I knew something really major had happened, because 7 o'clock there would have been 6 o'clock Dallas time. And my mother-in-law at the time was in her 90s, so I assumed it was her. And so when I got on the phone, I said, "Is it Mother?" And my brother-in-law said, "No, Mother's fine, but at 3:15 this morning, an airplane hit your house." So you can imagine the shock.
I'm sure you thought he was kidding. I mean, I'm sure you thought of it as a joke, because that just doesn't happen. But I guess the question that everybody asks was anyone injured? Was anyone killed?
You know, the blessing in this was that no one was killed. It actually hit our house. Our house was the first house to hit, and it took 6 feet out of one part of the upper structure and 4 feet out of the other. And in doing so, it actually flipped the plane, kind of turned it around, and then it crashed all the way through the back of the neighbor's house. Now, the plane had only been in the air 15 minutes, so it was loaded with fuel. So the blessings were that we weren't home, so my husband and I escaped any kind of trauma. The neighbors were asleep in the front of their house, and it crashed the back. Because it flipped the plane around backwards, it actually punctured the fuel tanks, and so there was no explosion or fire on impact. And the pilot and his unauthorized passenger were thrown backwards, so they suffered some injuries. I think he had a broken leg, but very minor injuries, and so everyone's life was spared.
Wow, and so he had an unauthorized passenger. Isn't that always interesting, that when you do something you really aren't supposed to do, something happens? I don't think something like crashing into a house all the time, but I mean, you often hear about unauthorized passengers, whether it's in a car or truck or a plane. Now, this is a show about living regret-free. So I know that your husband traveled every week at the time, so everything fell on you. And you are not a contractor, so you are what we do. You are a speaker, you are an author, you are a management consultant. What did you do? How did you navigate what I imagine is mostly a man's world of insurance adjusters, contractors, and so forth?
Well, Gail, in our businesses, we have to be resourceful, and I think sometimes we don't realize just how resourceful we can be. So it's kind of that old adage of 6 degrees of separation. I mean, I simply started making phone calls. I called a lawyer friend of mine, said, I'm not looking for legal advice, but is there anything I should know? And one thing led to another, and one by one, I just I knew I had to educate myself. I knew that I would be the one that was going to have to be handling everything. And, you make some mistakes along the way because you don't know what questions to ask. But when you make that mistake, then you dig into it and find out, well, what should I have done? And one by one, you just begin to be so much more knowledgeable than you ever thought you could. So I'd just say being resourceful really was the answer to that. Just making myself ask questions and think it through. What could I have asked differently? What should I have done differently?
Well, I know you hired a public adjuster. And I happen to know what a public adjuster is because when my son's house caught on fire, he had to really hire one. And truthfully, the adjuster really did do a good job for him. But with you, tell us why you hired one, and did this adjuster make things any better?
Well, the public adjuster, of course, is someone who's been in the insurance business, so they know the ins and outs of the insurance business. So when when you hire a public adjuster, that sets your own insurance company adjuster aside, and they negotiate with that public adjuster. In the beginning, that public adjuster actually knocked at our door as soon as I got home, and I was very offended by that. I sort of thought of him like the ambulance chasing lawyer,
I was just going to say, it sounds like that.
Yeah, and basically, I was probably pretty rude to him and sent him on his way. And he kept leaving things in the mailbox. And of course, initially we trusted our insurance adjuster. Now, in fairness to him, I suppose he hadn't taken care of many airplane crashes into houses. They just don't happen that frequently. But as I got smarter, I was able to find out that because our roof would have to be actually totally removed, that when that happened, I would have additional damage. And the insurance adjuster would just hear nothing of it. They would delay and delay, and the final straw was that one day I came home to a message from the insurance adjuster who said, we'll need to talk because you want to replace too many rafters. And I thought, oh no, this man just really doesn't get it. So out of desperation, and our neighbors hired that public adjuster. So I talked to them, and out of desperation, I convinced my husband that we should call the public adjuster. And they came out. We did hire them. Now, the good news is that they were then able to negotiate what would be called an open-ended claim. In other words, there was whatever had to be done was now going to be done. Now we were able to negotiate moving to a corporate apartment and have all of our furniture moved out and have a contractor come in and begin the repair work.
Now, let me ask you something, Betty. How long after this? I mean, how long was this between the time this happened and you hired the public adjuster?
It was a dreadfully long time. See, unfortunately, we were able to live in our house because it wasn't totally destroyed like the neighbors. And so the accident happened right after the 4th of July weekend, and we didn't get any of this resolved until late September, early October.
Because I was going to say, what if it was raining or the elements were coming into your house?
Well, and we had a big blue tarp over it that just covered our house for that entire time.
Oh, wow.
It was just, and it was, you can imagine the frustration because it was arguing with insurance companies and trying to get them to make a move and then getting information and trying to find a different resolve and not being willing. The neighbors, for example, realized their insurance company didn't even talk to them. They just sent them a check for what they thought it would be. Well, if they had signed that check, they would have been totally out of luck. So we just never agreed to anything, never signed anything. But the delay, you can imagine the frustration. Now, the bad side of it was that the public adjuster sort of shoved one of their favorite contractors onto us. They did parade about 3 contractors through, and yet they really pushed one. Well, we figured that they should know, and they said that this company had had previous work with that kind of a disaster. Well, it turned out that that contractor not only was unqualified, people began to not show up on the job. It was just a complete disaster with that contractor. And, of course, then the public adjuster wanted to kind of take no blame for any of that.
So you said that a lot of the trauma happened after the plane. So I assume this is the kind of trauma that you were dealing with.
Right, like it would begin in it doesn't snow often in Dallas, but come about November and December it begins to rain a lot. And so it would rain a lot. And we had moved all of our furniture to a warehouse of the contractor, which was in Fort Worth, and that was miles away from us. And then we moved into this apartment that was like a corporate apartment, and it was nearby. I wanted to be nearby so I could come home and pick up the mail all the time rather than having the confusion of that be one more thing. And so I would drive to the house, and one day I came over, and as soon as I opened the door, I heard this noise. Well, the tarp had filled with rain and broken more rafters and came through the ceiling, and the whole back of the house was flooded. My precipitating event, you might say, to really say, that's it, I've had it, was that I kept coming by the house, and little by little there would be no workers at the house. And one day I came by the house, and it was predicting rain, and my blue tarp was wafting in the air. It had these long strings, like a kite, just wafting in the air. So I called the contractor, got no answer. Called the public adjuster, they kind of blew me off. So I called my original insurance adjuster, and I negotiated with him. And he agreed to meet me at the house at like 4:30. So then I maneuvered with all of them. Then I called the public adjuster and said, you might want to know, but the insurance company is going to be there. Then I called the builder and said, you might want to know. And so that afternoon at 4:30, all these trucks came screeching up, and the insurance company's original adjuster got out and went, oh, my God, it's going to rain. Your house is going to flood.
Like
so
it hadn't
with
already.
That,
it already had flooded.
Well, right, but it would have flooded more. Now it would have just totally, because for all intents and purposes, this tarp wafting in the air would have been absolutely no good.
Well, you know, was there ever a really low point, Betty, when, during this year-long process that you felt like saying, I just can't do this anymore?
Yes, and I'll never forget it because it came the day before Christmas Eve. Prior to that, after that wafting tarp experience, I had negotiated with our insurance company that if they would work with me, I would fire the public adjuster. I couldn't fire the contractor because in the state of Texas, if you have a contract and you fire them, then you're still responsible. So I had to be very careful with him and maneuver to try to get him to sign out of the contract, which he finally did. Sent me a fax and said, if you're unhappy, I will release you from the contract. But my furniture was still in Fort Worth. All my household possessions. The insurance company had told me to hire a moving van and to arrange to get the furniture. But the builder stopped taking my calls. And so it was the day before Christmas Eve. I tried one more time to reach him, couldn't get a hold of him on any numbers, so I called the sheriff's department and explained my dilemma. And the sheriff said to me Ma'am, you've heard the expression,